Welcome to The Lead, a New Lines Magazine podcast on ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. I'm Anthony Elghossain, and I'll be your host this time around. We're lucky to have two great guests with us today, Hayat Aljowaily and Ola Salem. Hayat is an Egyptian filmmaker who lives in Europe. She's written, directed, and produced different motion pictures on global politics, cultural exchange, and identity. She's also worked as an assistant to the director for Moon Knight, the Emmy-nominated show we'll be discussing today. We'll chat about what it's been like to help make and then watch as a fan Moon Knight. Second, we'll talk about life experiences, identity, and professional perspectives while discussing the actual show Moon Knight, which has garnered general success and become particularly popular among Middle Eastern audiences in different states and diasporas. We're lucky to have our two participants because the show focuses on and reflects some of the promises and paradoxes of Egypt, a place near and dear to the hearts of both podcast participants. Joining us as a guest today, Ola is the managing editor at New Lines Magazine. A British Egyptian, she was one of the founding editors of New Lines and has a decade of experience covering the Middle East and North Africa. In addition to making the magazine run, Ola has some interesting and informative perspectives on Moon Knight, the show. Ola, Hayat, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Hayat, would you please tell us how you began pursuing your twin passions of politics and film?
Yeah, I've always been a very big fan of the arts. I started doing theater in kindergarten. I must have been in my first plays. And so it's something that was always near and dear to my heart and almost like came naturally to me. Both as a participant, I did a lot of theater, but also as a consumer. And one of the, all of my first memories kind of revolve around the films that I watched or the series that I watched. So when I was around 9, I moved back to Egypt from Switzerland, where my family had been living for a while. And I knew when the Disney episodes of like certain shows would come on, and I would go to my grandparents' house just to watch them. So it's really something that shaped my daily life almost, what my love for film, my love for TV. But at the same time, I grew up with both my parents worked in international relations, and I also grew up traveling a lot, or like moving a lot rather. And so at a very young age, became aware of my identity, aware of my difference in comparison to my classmates growing up in the US or in Switzerland. And so during my teenage years, I realized, okay, this is something that I can't separate myself from. And so I became really fascinated and passionate about social justice and diversity and representation. I think when choosing where to go for university, which sounds kind of cliche, but I think it's like the first moment as like a young adult where you face having to make a decision. I was like, okay, well, I love the arts. I'm very passionate about cinema, but at the same time, like I want to make sure that I am like fighting to make the world a more fair and just or equal place. And I was struggling to figure out how I could do both. And then I was lucky to find a program that would allow me to study politics for 2 years and then choose whatever I wanted for this following 2 years, which most people in the program ended up focusing on like economics or human rights, like one of the social sciences, versus I was like, nah, I'm gonna do film. And people at first were kind of confused because they couldn't see the correlation. But for me, it was like, film is such an impressive tool for social change because everyone consumes film, right? If you make, for instance, a Marvel film, there are millions of people all around the world who are watching it, no matter what their background is. And so I just realized that there was like an immense power that film had. And so the combination of the two just made a lot of sense to me. And that's how I ended up where I am.
Do you think of that person, that maybe younger self or others like you in your work?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think for me, as you were saying, like film or TV was a way for me to kind of have a home wherever I was. So growing up, kind of moving around a lot, at least when I was watching TV, there was some kind of constant in my life. And so the same shows that I watched, when I was living in Egypt, I then moved to the US and they were still there. And that gave me the opportunity to kind of have that. It's funny, I was about to use the word reality when it's actually not a reality. It's like some kind of alternate reality that is a constant. But then I also realized that I didn't feel represented in any of those, right? Like all the shows or movies that I was watching, none of them represented my experience. And so I watched them and I loved them, but I was like obsessed or emulating things that didn't represent who I was or my culture or my experience. And so I think something that's really important to me now that I've had the luck of being able to enter the industry is how do I make it so that my younger cousins who are like 14, 15 can watch these things and feel like they're a part of them and not just watching them from the outside, because that is usually how you feel every day when you are in the diaspora.
Could you tell us a bit about how you got involved or found your way to Moon Knight? Because I think what's really interesting about the show, I know Ola and others agree, is that it kind of does exist in both those worlds that you in particular find interesting.
Honestly, like a strike of fate. But I think just because there's, because I have these two passions and because Moon Knight is kind of, it's, the first Marvel series that takes place in Egypt, that has an Egyptian superhero character, etc. And then it's helmed by, an incredible director like Mohammed Diab. I feel like it was fate in the sense that I think I look up to him, I admire his work a lot, and eventually we would have come together. And I think Moon Knight was just the right moment and the right project for it.
And so before we turn to Ola, how was the experience for you working on Moon Knight, just as a sort of personal experience? We can get into the craft later.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's interesting because now it's about a year since we've wrapped on the show. And so it's kind of like a great time to be reflecting on it, because in the moment, obviously, it almost felt mundane sometimes because it's your everyday reality. Like you're taking the car, you're going to the studio. But it was in these mundane moments, you then have moments where you're like, oh my God, like this is a Marvel show. It's about Egypt. Michael Amewi is wearing a superhero suit. Like you just like I would have so many moments where it's just like, okay, like you're busy in the everyday thing, you're stuck in traffic, blah 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 blah, and then like I get into the studio and next thing I know I'm like saying good morning to Oscar Isaac and I'm like, how did I end up in this situation? So if I had worked on another Marvel series, I wouldn't have felt the way I did working on this one, knowing that I was also surrounded by people like Mohammed Diab and Ahmed Hafiz, the editor, and Hisham Nazih, the composer, and all the actors that were there, because I think that's what really made it feel more absurd, which is that like we're here and we're doing this and we're the first and hopefully not the last to be doing this. And that was just such an incredible feeling.
That's really, really cool to hear. Obviously, when folks talk about inclusion and belonging, it has to happen not just on the screen, but behind the show and off screen. So that's great to hear. Ola, we talked a bit about Moon Knight before, getting on this podcast, and I was just wondering, could you share with our listeners and Hayat what you thought about the show?
I really loved it. It was pretty awesome to watch from beginning to end. I could easily watch it again, and the second time I watch it will be different to the first time I watched it. And both times will be enjoyable. I'd never read the Marvel comic books before. I didn't even know there was a Marvel show that had anything to do with Egypt, to be honest. A very big thing about the show is that it has the first Arab female superhero, which is unheard of, really. So you have a lot of female strong characters, but then you have this one female character who is an abuser, the mother of Mark and Stephen. And I thought it was really interesting that, having those two characters and the contrast of it, because I mean, obviously you don't see the latter character until later on, and you kind of understand, but you kind of feel that that is probably one of the real villains in the show, because that's the reason why Mark/Stephen is the way he is, and the reason for his disorder.
Even with the mother, right? She is technically the villain because she's kind of at the source of all of this, but at the same time, she's suffering herself as well. She's evil because she's grieving. And I think that's something that we also really try to play, which is that it's not like she's always been like this. She was brought to this point because of losing her child, which is a very difficult and terrible experience to go through. So yeah, just wanted to agree.
I feel like probably the only person that's not a villain is Layla's character.
So yeah, in setting up this moral complexity, right? Mm-hmm. Man, woman, white, Middle Eastern, it's clear Layla, played by Mai Kalamaui, is in some ways the spine of the show. Mm-hmm. She carries for a long time Mark Spector, Stephen Grant, and somehow manages to maybe bend a little bit, but not break, even as purportedly more powerful or assertive characters sort of wilt to the will of others, including whether they're villains or anti-heroes or complex characters. So I wanted to ask both of you, right, as general viewers, but also as folks who are and identify as Egyptian women, how you felt watching Layla, a character as written and drawn, and then for those who maybe don't know the comics and the show, she's a composite character based on a few different elements, and then played brilliantly, and here we get into the performance, by Mai Kalamaui, who is also Egyptian origin. What did you guys think of both the character and the performance on the show? We'll start with Ola and then go to Hayat.
I do think that she kind of makes the show. Having her was such a game changer. I mean, just having somebody with curly hair that kind of resembles you and you kind of can see yourself in on the big screen is such a big deal. As someone who grew up in the West, you don't see or read stories or watch movies with characters that kind of look like you, sound like you. And to have somebody not just in a movie, but kind of like as a main character and then as a superhero, you feel like you can just, you can identify with something rather than reading stories that don't tell your story, that tell other people's stories. Knowing there were so many other Egyptian women behind the screen, like including you, Hayat, that is also a really big deal to know that, they're just front and center here. I do wonder whose decision was it to make her a character with Egyptian roots? Because from what Anthony told me before, is that in the comics, she's not actually Egyptian.
For the listeners, the flame or the romantic interest, at least in a lot of the comics, is an American, drawn as a blonde. But the composite character here of Layla includes some elements from that person and then some different elements that the writers and creators injected into her. So turn it over to Hayat on that point.
It was a big responsibility to create Layla because we also knew how important it was that she was going to be the first this, the first that, right? And so it's a big responsibility to the world, but also to young Arab women, to Arab women, period, Egyptian women, period. So it was very difficult, but it also meant that we gave her a lot of attention. And I think looking back, it was definitely my favorite part of the process was bringing her character to life, and that including in the writing process, when we would have these rehearsals with the whole cast and then the producers, Muhammad, Diab, obviously Sarah Gohar, his wife, who is also one of the writers and producers on the show. And so Oscar and Ethan and Aaron and Justin, the two other directors, like everyone really wanted to make Layla a strong character that people would look up to. But on the side, like there was me, there was Sarah Gohar, there was Mai, there was Amina. She was Mai's assistant. we also had personal stakes in this, you know. We were like, she had, as you were saying, Ola, like, she has curly hair. Like we were called, we're like the curly crew, because when all four of us would walk down the lot, everything was kind of like bouncing. Like you couldn't tell us apart because of all the curls, right? So we had personal stakes there, and so Layla had a little bit of all of us, and I think that's why a lot of Arab or Egyptian women felt like seen or represented by her, is because there was a lot of genuine kind of input into her from a lot of us behind the scenes, and from Mai personally, right? Mai dedicated so much of her life and her energy to this character. Of course, previous to Moon Knight, she had worked on a lot of like short films and some series. She had Rami, but Moon Knight to her was a new beginning and a new page. And so she did the stunt training herself. She came into Budapest, where we were shooting, almost a month early to do the stunt training herself, because she thought it was important for her to have the same physical strength that Layla as a character had. And she just really put her heart and soul into it. And I think you can sense that. And honestly, looking back, I'm really, really, really proud of the show as a whole, but specifically about Layla as a character, not just because she's the first Arab female superhero, but because she's authentic, right? Like she feels like she could be a friend of mine. And I think that's really important. We just figured out, how do we bring a little bit of each of us into her, and especially a little bit of May, since she's the one who embodied her.
Could I ask you to maybe mention what part of the performance spoke to you the most? Like, was there a scene? What did you pick up on the most and relate to the most?
The one that was like most imprinting is when she was dressed as a superhero, when you see her at the end. That kind of stays with you. Everything just looked it became iconic at that point.
I think to me, it was really the scene where I was like, wow, like, she's so real. Was the scene on the felucca. You see how much she cares about Mark, even though he's really hurt her. She understands that he's in pain as well, and that he's suffering. And it's just such an honest and raw moment between the two of them. And I think it's a really, really beautiful, because it shows her strength. Obviously, there's her strength as a superhero, right? There's her strength as the Scarlet Scarab. But I think what's really impressive about Layla is her strength just as a human being. Like, I think that I really like that scene because it really shows that.
So in the conversation, you've both mentioned from different viewpoints, authenticity and accuracy. And part of that's letting people shine. So Mai Kalamawi is shining as a general performer who's happening to inform the role, it seems, or certainly in some scenes, with the specificity of her background. Same with Antonia, same with others. But what about places? So you mentioned Hayat, and Ola, in doing her research, emphasized this point too, that Muhammad Diab and others on the initial creative team had wanted to depict Egypt, Egyptians, Arab origin people, even Arabish people, let's say, accurately, and also bring Cairo to life. Now, anyone who's actually been to Cairo, let alone lived there, knows it's a behemoth, it's a massive city, it's loud, it's boisterous. You didn't film there.
Portraying Cairo accurately, or Egypt accurately, was, I think, at the essence of Muhammad Diab's pitch to Marvel. So if you've done any research on the show, like, Muhammad always speaks about how him and Sarah developed a 200-page pitch when they were pitching to Marvel. And I can tell you that at least 30% of that pitch is, look at all these Hollywood productions that have done a terrible job at accurately representing Arab cities or North African cities. And so that was really at the core of what we were trying to achieve. And I think, unfortunately, so the goal initially was to shoot in Egypt. Unfortunately, we were not able to do that. And so we basically, it was like, okay, we can't shoot in Egypt, but we have to make it look like it's Egypt. And in a way, that meant not going to shoot in Morocco and pretend it's Egypt, because then it's not going to look like Egypt. And thankfully, it's a Marvel show. Marvel has a lot of budget. And so we built Egypt. So literally, like, we had, like, in the studios, a massive space, Orgo Studios in Budapest, and there was like this big empty space, and then within 2 weeks it was Cairo. Like, I can't describe to you how absurd of a concept that is, but we had an amazing production designer. Her name is Stefania Cella, and she was like, okay, like, you guys want Cairo, I'll give you Cairo. But of course, right, the actual infrastructure, or like the architecture, is one thing, but the taste, the vibes, the chaos of Cairo is another. And so she had as a consulting art director Ali Hussein, who's one of the biggest art directors in Egypt, and he kind of brought that flavor that you wouldn't get unless you've seen these things firsthand and lived them. So if you look on the walls, sometimes you can see like the handprints from like the Eid, and when you like put the hand, small things like that. If there's like an ayah from the Quran on top of some door, all these little small details that make it feel like we're shooting in Egypt. And obviously you can't necessarily recognize a specific location, like, oh, this is that street, because it is built on a studio. But the general sentiment, I think we succeeded in making it feel like it's Egypt. And you can sense that on screen, but you could sense it off screen. Like the day that we were shooting the scenes, the Cairo street scenes, I was stressed because I thought I was gonna get like street harassed. You know what I mean? And that's a horrible thing, that's the first thing you think of about walking around Cairo. But like, you know, we were like, even Mai said the same, like, you're walking and there's so many people and so many cars and it's loud. And I kept like looking behind me, you know, and that's how real it felt. So I think we did well. It's unfortunate we weren't able to shoot in the actual location, but looking back, it was so chaotic on a back lot that I'm terrified to think what it would have been like if we'd actually shot in Cairo.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't until after watching it and researching about the show that I realized it actually wasn't shot in Cairo. I really did think it was shot in Cairo. Kind of like Hayat said, it's I mean, I remember watching The Mummy, and you have scene of Brendan Fraser looking for a tomb, and then you have these quote unquote Egyptians in the background, and they're shouting in, I don't know what Arabic dialect it was, but it definitely wasn't Egyptian and may not have been even Arabic. You're basically drawn into a movie and you kind of get sucked out immediately because you realize like, oh, actually, wait, this is not real. So, you know, a lot of movies have lost that. And, you know, watching things with like Arabic references or so on, it kind of always made you feel like, oh, they're going to get something wrong. Like it's, and sometimes they do it intentionally. It feels like Hollywood intentionally makes us look in certain ways, depicts us in certain ways, because that's what the audience is looking for. And that's what the audience is used to. And they just don't want to divert from that. And I think what the director Mohammed Diab did here was incredible, that he made sure that it was actually authentic. It goes against what people would think is Egypt or is Cairo. I remember going to you know, summers in Cairo, and my parents, you know, and I have family in Giza, and you can look out the window and it's incredibly busy, and from a distance you see the pyramids. And I do remember also when I was, you know, like I was an 8-year-old and I was in England and studying about ancient Egypt in primary school, and then telling my parents, you know what, when I go back to Egypt this summer, I really want to go see the pyramids because we studied all about it. And then when I went to the pyramids, I was shocked. I was like, wow, this is really busy. This is really hectic. Like there is, you know, life all around it. It's nothing like the pictures you see in the books where it's all desert. It's literally a city built around these pyramids. And I thought, you know, the authenticity and all these little details were what made Moon Knight such a great show. And even to the point where you had Egyptian music in the credits. So, you know, one of the songs is a remix of a song by, you know, Egyptian diva Kulthum. And I remember playing Kulthum in the car sometimes, and my kids would say, oh, why are you playing Arabic music? Switch it to English. Going right now we're in America. They've lived all their life in America. They don't speak a lot of Arabic, so when they hear Arabic music, they say, we want to switch to English. But they watched Moon Knight with me, and now when they hear Kulthum, they say, oh, that's Marvel's Moon Knight. That's from Marvel's Moon Knight, and they seem really proud of it. And
they had to use a remix though, because they'd had to spend a whole episode if it were like one of her real songs. But go ahead.
Yeah, all right. One time they told me, it's like, oh, after this, can you switch to an English song? I said, okay. And they said, well, how long is this song for? I was like, 45 minutes. It was like a proper Kulthum song. But as an Egyptian mom, it's really incredible to kind of like, and then one of my kids were actually humming it the other day in the car, just humming an Kulthum song. And it's really from these details, honestly, that has a big impact.
And so you both alluded to this, and I just want to emphasize it for the listeners, because in the notes, we've repeatedly seen this was a creative emphasis to make the city come alive, but make the pyramids feel proximate, both physically but psychologically. I was going to ask also, what did we think, and Ola, you'd mentioned this before, about the portrayal of abuse? For those folks who don't know, the protagonist struggles with dissociative identity disorder. One of the triggering events for the character is the physical and other abuse that's revealed in late episodes that his mother perpetrated. And we should emphasize, his father didn't necessarily stop. Why I found that interesting is you can kind of see the imprints that the distinct personalities have in the way they react to assertion, violence, dominance by others. Anyway, I don't want to belabor the point. I just wondered what the two of you thought about the portrayal of abuse, and as Ola mentioned, abuse perpetrated by a woman, the mother.
So obviously, I am not an expert on DID whatsoever, but we had psychologists kind of as consultants on the show, and I am fascinated by psychology, and I did some reading when we were doing the show and everything. And so DID does usually kind of appear as a disorder due to childhood abuse or trauma. So we wanted it to be nuanced in the fact that the mother was also suffering, but also very clear in the fact that what she was doing was wrong, and that had a very, very profound impact on Mark. So yeah, and I do think like it was really important for us to add this depth, right? Like we didn't want to gloss over that, like making a show about DID without talking about like the trauma that comes, like that it stems from, would have been inauthentic as well. And even though like Disney Plus is obviously accessible to children, and so we had restrictions in terms of like what we could really openly talk about, we did want to make sure that it wasn't just a superhero show, because if it's a superhero who has DID, then we have to touch on why and how and what it is, right? And it was very difficult, and I think there's always room to kind of try to get these things more and more right, but it was important for us at least to kind of delve into it a little bit.
So, and we'll turn to the future now, so we won't spend too much time on this, but writers initially looked at some movies as inspiration, and they're kind of incorporated into the show. So an Indiana Jones style movie is incorporated into the show. But while I love Indiana Jones and I hate snakes, I do think Indiana Jones and similar movies are some of the problematic movies that we've seen in Hollywood in the way they depict Arab or Arabish folks, right? Maybe there's one good character, and then there's a mindless mob of men that are like the backdrop to the protagonist's activity. I mean, did you feel like this show it's building upon that as it's a step forward? Was there a conscious effort to sort of take that genre of the swashbuckling protagonist and just do it while respecting the peoples of the place more?
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. And I think like there is definitely something that's always going to be inherently Orientalist about um like a in this case American, but European or white or however we want to go with man who's like traveling to a distant foreign land to find out about this exotic, like situation. There's always gonna be something that's a little off about it. Like, is it possible to have the kind of like adventure Indiana Jones type genre while also making it authentic? Yes, I think, while making it non-Orientalist, I don't know.
What's fascinating in Moon Knight, and I think the Marvel Studios overall has been tracking in this direction. In the earlier phases of the so-called Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is now almost like a multi-platform multiverse, you had this men of science sort of leading the charge, the Tony Starks, the Bruce Banners, and now we have more mysticism, magic, and horrors. Hayat, now that we've talked a bit about you, the show, you ended your last remarks talking more generally about what you'd like to see. So I think it's a good time to maybe ask you about the craft of cinema, right? What you think about it? Is it a craft? Is it a science? Is it an art? And what did you learn most or find most valuable while working on Moon Knight? And then we can wrap up the conversation by talking a bit, if you'd like, about what you have in store. Ola, mutual friends like Danny Hajjar, people all over our community of readers and listeners are already kind of rooting for you. So I'm sure folks would love to know what's next in store, what you have planned.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, about whether cinema is an art or a craft or a science, I think it's a little bit of all of that. And that's what I find really cool about film, is that you don't have to be an artist to work in film. You don't have to be, it's an industry at the end of the day. And so you can be a lawyer and work in film. There's so much science to it, especially now with all the technology. Like, man, I kind of am like, I wish I knew how to code. Like when we were talking about the CGI characters, I'm like the CGI builder. Like, there's just such a huge part of film now that is more quote unquote scientific. But even the very basics of cinema is physics, right? Like lights and sound and all of that. And so I suffered a lot in film school when I'd opened the textbook and it's like all these graphs. I'm like, I don't know what's happening here. But yeah, no, so I think it's a little bit of all of that, and that's what's magical about it. And to me, cinema always kind of boils down to collaboration, right? And that's the thing that I love about it most, is that you're not sitting by yourself painting or drawing or writing. It's a process that includes at least two people, if not thousands. So on Moon Knight, I think our total crew was around 1,200 people. And that's my favorite part kind of the film world, is that it's a collaboration. It's the voices and the craft and the art and the science of a whole bunch of people coming together. And that's like the movie magic to me, is that what is the most valuable thing I learned? It's kind of like almost more personal, rather than like it's not like a physical lesson, I guess, as much as it's like, but it's that you can do something that you love and something that's positive for your community, for your people and everything, and one, still have it be like a job and something that's like financially viable but also something that is commercial and on a big scale. Because I think people tend to think like, oh, if you want to make something that's like political or something that's going to make a mark on the world, or be, it has to be an art house, indie film, whatever. But I think the greatest part of this project was learning or figuring out that, like, no, like, you can make something like Marvel have a political or a sociological impact, right? And for me, like, over the last couple of months since the show has come out, I've traveled a lot. I've worked in different places with very different types of people, and basically everyone I talk to says oh yeah, Moon Knight, like either I've watched it or I know about it. And the ability to have an impact on such a large scale of people, from people who are Arab and who did feel represented, to people who are from a completely different part of the world, know nothing about Egypt, and had a door open to them and an interest that blossomed, like, is so magical. And I think moving forward to like what I want to do and the projects I'm working on now, is that I really want to continue working in this middle ground of making art, making cinema that's accessible and that is palpable and that is exciting and that is entertaining. Because I think, Ola, in the very beginning of our conversation, you brought out that word. You just said it's good entertainment. So I want to make good entertainment that also is championing the causes that I care about. So for instance, I'm currently working on a short film. I'm in Serbia right now scouting for a short film that I'm co-directing, hopefully soon. It's been a long and tedious process, about 2 Palestinian refugees who, at the onset of the COVID pandemic, have 24 hours before the borders close to decide whether they want to stay in Serbia indefinitely or return home to Palestine. And even though it sounds very political upfront, right? It's a story about friendship, above all, but it's also very visually funky, honestly. Like I'm co-directing it with a Serbian friend of mine, and we want to make it funny. It's really funny because the script is not funny, but all the actors that we've had auditioned have had, and I'm excited for that, because I don't want people to watch it because it's about Palestinian refugees. I want people to watch it because it's a fun film to watch, and then when they come out of it, they're like, oh wait, like maybe we should care about this. So yeah, that's it's the project I'm knee deep in right now because I'm scouting for it, but I have hopefully soon like a slate of other similar projects, documentary and feature, that all have, I think, one thing in common, which is that they're fun and they're entertaining, but they're also saying something about our community, about our people, and about the world that we live in.
Yeah, rejecting false choices. That sounds good to me. Ola Salem, Hayat Aljowaily, thank you both for joining us today. It was a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you, Ola. It was such a pleasure chatting with you guys.
Thank you both.
Thanks for joining us today. To hear more from Hayat, you can find her on Twitter at XHAYATYX. This has been The Lead, the New Lines podcast. This week's episode was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Anthony Elghossain. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, www.newlinesmag.com.